Okay, welcome to the fourth edition of the Readers Club conversation. And today we are joined by Manjima because the Readers Club yesterday read her play called The Mountain of Bones. And so today Manjima is here to speak to us about her process of writing the play and her journey with some of the questions that the play talks about, particularly around the experiences of hunger. And we've asked her a bunch of questions as well because we've been exploring the idea of what it means to tell an authentic story, especially when you're writing from experience of you're writing a character whose life you've not experienced, and your experience does not exactly relate to lives, the lives of your character. And so we're very curious to understand how Manjima went about writing her play, given that the play is located in a historically different time and has characters who are, sort of belonging to all kinds of identities. So, some who might be closer to Manjima's own lived reality, and others who might be very far off. But also, just to imagine a very different time and space through her play. And when we were speaking to her, she said how she, as a writer, finds her work to be that of bridging distances between experience and um imagination, between history and present, between all of these kind of different binaries or opposite ends of the shore. And so we're very curious to understand from Manjima how she goes about doing that in her writing process and how she answers and grapples with these questions. So, Manjima, over to you. Reminding you to hit record on your phone as well so that folks who are listening into the podcast can hear her opening statements. The way we'll do the conversation is that we'll hear a opening statement from Manjima, and then we can ask questions and chat. Cool? So, Manjima, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Apeksha. Um, this is an interesting question, particularly in the light of Mountain of Bones, because the play is set around the 1943 Bengal famine, and in many ways is, I suppose, very distant from at least my life. But of course, like we were discussing the other day, there are a lot of resonances also. But just to kind of talk a little bit about how I came to it. Um, so, initially when I started writing, I actually started properly writing for the theatre with Writer's Block. And that was in 2006, 2007. Of course, Rage and the Royal Court Theatre were putting that together. And we had Carl Miller and Phillida Lloyd as our mentors. At that point of time, I picked up a story which was closer to my own experience, and then I kind of worked around it. Eventually, the next few plays that I wrote were also about relationships, they were about man woman relationships in different ways and different forms. And then one of the directors that I was working with, he actually turned around and asked me, so this is your thing, right? You write about relationships. And I have this, this lifelong I don't know what to call it, fear, hatred of being put in a slot. So I really resented him for a while for asking that question. But later, when I thought about it, he had a point, because pretty much everything that I was writing did connect back to specifically male-female relationships. Um, Now, after I had my children, I took a step back. I wasn't taking on too much work. I'd also not been writing for a while. Um, Around this time, this is 2011, the farmer suicides were had really kind of started to capture the media imagination. And P. Sainath was doing a lot of was really drawing a lot of attention to this issue. He was regularly writing. The Hindu, the Indian Express were carrying these news articles, but Sainath particularly did this series on Andhra Pradesh, um, focusing on farmer suicides in Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, and it was an absolutely heartrending series. Also, I mean, extraordinarily well researched, of course, and that's how I started getting interested in um, in the idea of the person who provides the food going hungry. That's where it really started from. Um, as a person, I've known hunger, and not metaphorically, physically also. I've gone to bed hungry, I know what it's like. So that for me was a hook. And it's a very, I think it's a very basic kind of emotion that comes out of that. Um, I know a lot of people who will cry when they're hungry, you know, the strongest of men, who are trying to kind of create an impression of themselves, they'll also cry when they're hungry. So that's something which is very basic. And around this time, I started reading other material. I read a short story by a Bengali writer called Manik Bandyopadhyay called "Why Didn't They Snatch and Eat?" And of course, the character of Jogi Dakat in the play comes from that story directly. Um, I had also, all through my childhood, I was very fond of fantasy and folk tales. And there's this particular collection of stories called Thakurmar Jhuli or Grandmother's Bag, which was full of these stories, which I slowly started to realize were essentially about hunger. They were about poverty. They were about, you know, extremely difficult circumstances that people had to overcome. And it was later, of course, I've always been very, very interested in folk tales and the way that they tell stories. And these so-called fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen, everywhere there were so many resonances that came out at me. I was telling you just now about the fact that there was this particular song which we had heard through our childhood, which is this very, very nice, very dramatic kind of song, which we all loved singing because it was a great hit, right? And of course, only later in life, but like when I was in college or something, did I realize that that song is actually about the Bengal famine of 1943. So a lot of this embodiment of the terrors that we face in our everyday lives, in the form of rakshasas, and we have this term Rakhush, Kokkush, these are all these mythical beings who bring about these tribulations. And as these pieces kind of started to kind of, fall into place, I started to research. Um, I had time on my hands in those days, so I went to the Nehru Memorial Library and looked up newspapers from that period. Particularly, the Amrita Bazar Patrika was a very, very helpful English language publication which was reporting from the citizen's perspective, which was rare because the Statesman, for instance, was very biased in favor of the British. So at that point of time, the Amrita Bazar Patrika was like Indians writing in English for other Indians, and that was a big thing. And it was severely critical of Indian people who were in the administration as well. Also calling out newspapers, other newspapers, everyone in the pay of the government. I don't know how they managed to run, but they did. So a lot of the stuff that you hear in the play, the scientist seeking to, asking people to eat grass, it comes from the news. Okay, so this was actually there in the news, and it ran for a few weeks. So there were a series of scientists who were conducting research on edible grasses and how could they help abate the famine in Bengal. And you had the food was being taken away by cartloads, and the boats, which were a lifeline for Bengal. Bengal is largely a riverine land, right? So a lot like Kerala. So the boats were like the lifeline of the transport system. So the internal transportation came to a complete halt because the British thought the Japanese were going to attack. So local trade came to a halt. In many ways, in so many ways, the famine was man-made. It was deliberately inflicted upon Bengal. So I started to realize that I couldn't really tell the story of the famine without getting into the story of the war. So we got into the war, got into understanding the politics of it, got into really kind of breaking down. What were the local people doing? Why was nobody coming to the aid of the famine struck poor people? Why did it take so long for any kind of response to develop? And why was it so ineffective? Um, One of the newspapers was carrying the works of an artist called Chitta Prasad. Chitta Prasad was a leftist, a communist artist who um, basically he said it was his internship covering the famine in Bengal. He went around all of Bengal drawing sketches and made it his mission that those sketches should find their way out into the wide world. Those sketches are absolutely heartrending. I was very lucky that sometime in 2012, um, those sketches were made available at an art gallery in Delhi, and I was able to actually go and see them and also pick up a book of those sketches. So they went a long way towards really kind of helping me develop a sensibility and an approach. Um, but all of this was happening in the background, and eventually what happened is that I was working in a school. I'd joined a school, and I was doing something which is completely not at all connected with all the research I'd been doing the year previous. And I was attending a training, and in the middle of that training, this babu with the bag, going to the market to buy food, he literally just popped into my head, and the first scene just played itself out. So for me, that was where it started to take shape as a play, because until then, I didn't know what kind of shape it was going to take. I hadn't set out to research actively with the thought of writing a play. I was just reading because I was enjoying reading, enjoying getting into that era, learning about it, trying to understand it. So, Bengal is a very contradictory land, and for me, I've lived away from Bengal for more than half my life now. And in 2011, I had been living away for over 13, 14 years. And while I felt a deep emotional connect, I also realized that I didn't know much about the land. So this is the way that our learning is skewed, right? Now, of course, they're trying to make a change. They're trying to bring in more learning about the local culture and learning about local history. But in those days, all that you learned about India's history was Delhi, right? Maybe the mota mota a little bit about, okay, so Tipu Sultan, okay, so Shivaji, so like big heroes, very person centric. Um, so I came across this book by this gentleman called Nihar Ranjan Rai, and it was called um, The History of the Bengali People. And that for me was very interesting because until then, histories had always been about heroes, big happenings. I'd never read a history which was about people. And NRI's story took the perspective of common people, explored local culture, and started to give me an image of, I mean, for me, it was very personal. It was almost like he was talking to me. But by that time, I was in that stage. It really felt like he was telling me a story about the land that I had grown up in and had a deep emotional connect with, which I had no idea of. So, as this history of post partition or pre partition India came together with these folk and fantasy tales, the historical aspect of things really helped me to understand the sensibilities with which to approach this piece because um, Bengal is a very peculiar country. I'd say country almost. Like I mean, the word we use is desh. It's it's a very peculiar land because people really, there is a everybody knows that Bengali people are lazy, right? Everyone knows that. But you have to understand there is a logic to that. And the logic is very simply that prosperity is about going to sleep with a full belly. Full stop. There is nothing else that matters. So when you've come from such intense poverty, when you've come from a space where if you have free time and you're prosperous and if you have free time, you would rather spend your time making music than making more money. Um, that was something I struggled to understand for the longest time, but I think Manik Bandyopadhyay's story really changed the perspective for me in many ways, because this whole idea of who owns the land, and this idea that we all own the space together and we belong to each other rather than seeking to own, I think that was something that for me really took a long time to register. I don't know whether that sensibility comes through in the play, you tell me. But for me, it was that which kind of helped the whole thing click. The idea that um, ownership is not the only way to look at the world we live in. One can also turn it around and look at it as belonging. But when one who looks at belonging to the world comes in conflict with one who looks at owning it, what happens then? Um, so, yeah, a friend of mine loves to say that every story is a love story. And I remember reaching out to him and saying, look, I've written a story and it's not a love story. But maybe it is. Maybe it is about being in love with the land, and being in love with the people who live close to the land. As somebody who's grown up in a city all my life, it was very difficult to connect to that idea. Um, so the research really helped, but I think without the stories, without the music, some personal anecdotes which later came my way by way of grandparents and the stories that they have shared of living in a village, of coming through from there. Also, some personal anecdotes from experiences of having traveled a little bit of the countryside. All that came together. But yeah, that's how it is. It was very organic, um, and I hope that somewhere the research and the, for me, realizations, they serve to bring in a note of authenticity, because I think I think one thing is to look at a local flavor and to look at where something emerges from, where something comes from. But for me, it was more about um, really um, a voice that emerges from within you, and a voice that says what it wants to. I really debated Babu hanging himself. It was something which, and especially as somebody with a background in education, it was something which was very against my own sensibilities. But it just, it was just what felt true to the character. I couldn't give him another ending which would have been honest. Um, so yeah, so that was the basic journey of Mountain of Bones.
Okay, Aditya, Nipun, Falguni, do you have questions? Because I have one that is immediately jumping at me, and if you guys don't mind, I'll go for it. You said that word realizations, and I think I mean, in my own journey of doing this work, I'm also an educator, so there is that element to it, and I find that word realizations is a very important word, because I think that is, that's where the churning is really happened, where you've had to break notions that you held before the journey you take to learn something, and you have to unlearn something and realize something else, and it kind of changes you fundamentally. So you said realizations, and I kind of want to ask if you don't mind sharing some of these realizations with us, because yeah, I'd love to hear.
Um, one of the things that really kind of hit me about hunger, for instance, um, this idea that the hungry body eats itself. Um, immediately resonated with me when I read Manik Bandyopadhyay, because I've actually one of those stories that are in the play is actually something I've witnessed myself. I have seen a man starve to death, and it is something which changes you. Um, it is a I think when we think about life, we think about life in terms of, what do we do next, what lies ahead of me, how do I plan for the future, and but what if the immediate moment is something which completely takes over your past, present, future, everything. It's like it's all, everything is now, in the now, and that moment then becomes critical. And for me, I don't think I've been able to walk past that moment. you know that moment has become a part of my present. um, so I've always recognized hunger as something which matters to me. um, but it never hit me with the kind of the kind of strength and the kind of realization as it did when I saw that. And somewhere I think maybe writing that story down is also a way of trying to understand it, trying to grapple with it. Similarly, I read the Dalim Kumar story, The Pomegranate Prince. That story I read in Thakurmar Julie as a child, and it always struck me as a very dark and spooky story. It had this eerie snake, which was like really skinny, the muslin snake, and it had these people who turned other people into stone and things like that. So all these stories are elements of that story, Dalim Kumar. But the image of the horses grinding down the mountain of bones, it just, while I was writing and I was trying to imagine what kind of, I thought initially that I'd take elements of different stories from Thakur Julie. But I got stuck on this one. I couldn't move past it because that image was such a strong one. Again, in terms of, it suddenly struck me that this is about memory. This is about what we do with trying to grapple with our present and the difficulties we don't know how to handle. So, this idea that there is a mountain of bones, and then the prince with his horses just they grind it down to powder, they level it down. So that was another, yeah. So as an adult, many things start to make sense in many different ways, and that's why I guess fairy tales are eternal, and they're abiding because they convey so much through images. I don't know if that was the answer you were looking for.
I mean, it definitely helps to take the conversation forward, and yeah, I'm going to open the floor again. Falani, Aditya, Nipun, do you guys want to ask anything, say anything? Go for it.
Uh, yeah, Manjima, you were speaking about having that sense of alienation from the land you grew up in. Like you've been away from the land, and to write about something that you've been away from for so long. Like I experience a similar thing. I am from Karnataka, and I've grown up everywhere but there. So when I go back to that state, I know Kannada, but I'm not. It's not as pure as it's not as like pure as a pure Kannadiga would speak.
Hmm.
And if and there are stories that I want to talk about in my mother tongue and of the place where I come from. But then I'm like, do I really belong there? That idea of belonging.
Hmm.
I was curious to know if that's something you encountered in your writing, in your process. Like, how do you that internal struggle, how do you sort of navigate that?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. It's something which, um, yeah. So even growing up in Calcutta in the 80s and 90s, I went to an English medium school. Bangla was definitely my second language. Also, Calcutta is very cosmopolitan, right? It's, almost like Bombay. So it has a distinct culture of its own. So I've always aligned myself with the culture of Calcutta, which is very English speaking, which is very, um, which is a kind of space where you can find yourself at home in almost any city in the world, right? But when you encounter songs, when you encounter stories that really belong to the heartland of Bengal, when I've encountered those, I've always wondered, and a big part of the process for Mountain of Bones was really asking myself the question: do I have the right to tell the story? You know, am I? And in fact, there's a companion piece which happened while Mountain of Bones was in process. There was this play which emerged out of it, out of those two men on the tree. That took its own kind of shape and became another play of its own. And I'd written it as a radio play called Two Men on a Tree. That story even more so because again it was um, first up. I was like, I really questioned myself, and why do I want to tell the story in the voice of two men? Why is there no woman there? it was, but it was a story that wanted to be told. It was a story that came out of a news piece. There was an authenticity to it. And I thought about it and I said, if it was women there, the story would be a different story entirely. And maybe someday I'll write that. I don't know. But at that moment, the story that emerged was the story of those two men. Similarly, for Mountain of Bones, by and large, the story was it emerged from the middle class that I was familiar with. And that's why the figure of Babu, I think, is like a bridge between my sensibilities and my development as a young person growing up in middle class Calcutta. Um, and he is like the figure that helps me to enter into that space. It's almost like he's the guide into that space because he's the guy who interacts with Jogi Dakat. He's the guy who interacts with the communists. He's the guy who's reading the newspaper. So a lot of this is coming through him. So for me, that the figure of the Babu is critical in that moment, and that's my closest association. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was very important to have the stories there so that they could tell themselves rather than my having to create new stories to tell. Because I'll be very honest, I was very um, there are times when I feel very empty when I dig into that well because I feel like I don't know whether I have the right to do that. I don't know how far I belong. And I lived in Calcutta only for 18 years of my life, and I'm now 44. So for the better part of my life, I haven't lived there. So even more so, but fundamentally, it's a human story. There's a universality to it. Unfortunately, there is a lot of um, I mean, I still find resonances in our day, our era, you know, uh, this country, other countries. It's one of those things that are universal. So, yeah. So I'm a little bit of an interloper where the language and the culture is concerned, but I'm trying.
And the thing you spoke about the absurdity, you spoke about how I think there was a news piece back then where they introduced edible grass, like that was like a running this thing, and made me think about how much of like we look for if we are writing an absurd play or we are writing a satire, we think we have to create that world, but a lot of the times we are living in that world,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
It
It's a, I
it
mean, so much.
actually it actually made me think of Donald Trump's hydrochlorine press conference, if you guys remember, like during the COVID pandemic, how he was asking people to inject hydrochlorine in inside themselves to prevent COVID and all that. So it was just very bizarre. That was the first thought that came into my head when I heard. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and this is just one thing, So even the other stuff, the price of grains and all of that, it was absurd. And editorial after editorial was calling it out. But the kind of responses that the ministers were giving was like, yeah, nothing has changed much. A lot of them sounded a lot like Trump.
Or Nirmala Sitharaman for that matter, who said, I don't eat onions,
Onions.
so, what
So
does
it's
it matter
passive.
to me? Yeah. I actually, I mean, because you said about Babu, I wanted to bring that question in. And I think in the initial conversation, we also spoke a little bit about location and, struggling with writing from the location one comes from, which is to at least a great extent a privileged location, and, how does one then relate to that privileged location, especially in the context of caste, but also perhaps class and, various things. Um, and I feel that because, you said about Babu as your primary connecting character, that actually you're able to show Babu as a very messy character, because you can show that, okay, yes, while one relates to his vulnerability, one can also see very clearly, like at moments where he's kind of not exactly doing the ethical thing, he's just doing the thing that he's going to get by with, and and the unethicalness of that thing is very evident in the way that you're telling his story. And I am curious to know how you felt about that, because I think that, it's also very revealing of oneself, right? Like how we also on many occasions end up doing the unethical thing, or the the selfish thing, or the and very much in the times we live in right now, where even the most ethical person will be confronted with situations where they might not be able to take those decisions.
Yes, see, the thing is that, when it comes to ethics, we tend to apply them to the larger decisions of life, right? Like the big things. When it comes to everyday, I don't know how many times I've seen people in my own father, my uncles and all. I've seen them go out and give a small bribe. How many times has that happened, right? You see, when you're like you just had a traffic infraction and you want to get out of there, to 100 rupiya pakda do or nikal do, right? So I think it's for me it was interesting to see that play out in the light of the larger absurdity of things that was happening and how the whole thing builds up to a tragedy. Because it's see, I'm a very big this thing of Bertolt Brecht. I really I'm very inspired by him and his writing. The people, as we see, are never innocent and blameless, right? We are all complicit in framing our reality. And it's important for us to understand how that complicity works. How does it actually play out in the real world? More often than not, if we're just looking at getting by, like you said, just that, just getting past this particular moment and going to the next one. So at this moment, that little bit of unethical behavior doesn't matter. It's fine, and it's more interesting, right? That's what makes us interesting, also. As a dramatic character, I'd be very put off, I think, by somebody who always did the right thing. They'd be boring than anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps dishonest also, but I think that to be able to show the darkness of the person we relate to, or the location we relate to, I think that itself is, when we're talking about authenticity, right? So it's easier to say, for instance, paint a darker character or a less layered character for someone who you've not experienced, but when you've experienced it firsthand, and to stay authentic to that, to the darkness of that, I think that for me is a, it's still a struggle. Like when I try to write, I don't think it's so easy to show the ways in which you are messed up. It's easier to show how other people are messed up, but
Always,
yeah.
always. But I think for me, the character of Babu was never squeaky clean. And the idea of if there is a if there is a victim in there, then perhaps it's the hungry crowd, and that's why it's not that's why it doesn't have a name. It doesn't have characters. It is a bit of a symbol more than anything else. But again, that came partly from Chine Kano, partly from this really insightful piece that Shekhar Gupta wrote on, he was trying to understand how Mamata might win the election. And it's a very interesting point that he said. He said, the reason that Mamata might win the election, this was the first time that he was on the journey with her, is because the poverty in Bengal is not as bad as it might have been. He said if the poverty in Bengal was really abject, the communists would have continued to win. So it was very interesting because he said that the erasure of voice is directly related to the degree of poverty that you're subject to. It's once you start to gain a degree of prosperity, you start to develop a voice. And this really kind of linked me very quickly back to Manik Bandopadhyay's story, where he says they were just, they were so poor that they weren't thinking, they stopped thinking. So that's where the hungry crowd comes from. Um, and yeah, that's probably why it doesn't really have too much of a character. Yeah.
Falguni has a question.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, you mentioned yesterday after the reading that you had forgotten how grim the play was. So I was curious to know, like the play is a satire. It has like musical elements and like to perform it. I mean, there are parts where you laugh at the absurdity of what's happening. So I was curious to know that, but did you decide at the start that you wanted to write in this form, or did what informed the form, or what informed, like, how did that happen?
So once again, this is a very Brechtian element in the play. Um, Came from the administrators, and like Nipu was saying, some of that stuff that came out of the newspapers, it was so absurd that putting it out as realistic dialogue seemed like I didn't know how it would make sense. And I thought if I actually put it out as realistic dialogue, it will never work. So when I started writing the administrators, I kind of saw them as, maybe 2 or 3 people. Initially, I wasn't really sure. And then I cut it down to 2 people for the sake of a little bit of neatness. But they were a group that talked in rhyme and were very gleeful about the whole thing. So it just, yeah, and then it came to me as a silly song. So I said, okay, let me write it as a silly song, and let's see how it kind of emerges from there. So if you kind of put that next to the grimness of the old woman's story and the relatively more serious aspects of the Jogi Dakat track, Jogi Dakat and Babu track, then you can see how it kind of counterbalances that. It brings in comedy and it brings in absurdity into that kind of space, which I think sharpens the satire. At least I hope it sharpens the satire. And also allows people to take that bitter pill. Otherwise, it would be unrelievingly dark. Yeah.
Aditya and Nipun, do you have more things to like to talk about? I found it very interesting what you said about form, kind of, because we always talk about the substance of, like, so how to build an authentic story. We talk about the research that goes in, and how the substance of it, like what are you going to say exactly, and then we say, okay, like, but form also contributes to how something becomes or doesn't become authentic. Like if you try to pass it off as, there's not just substance, it's also form. And that's a very interesting insight. Thank you so much for that. Aditya, sorry, did I interrupt? You were going to say something.
I actually, I haven't read the play. I'm going to read it now. I really wanted to attend the talk because I saw the poster and I read the whole thing, and I then Googled about the play, and I read your interview at Mumbai Theatre Guide. So that's why I don't have many questions about the play because I want to read it tonight because it's sounding uh crazy. Yeah. So but yeah.
It's a bit crazy. Yeah.
And yeah, but I could relate so much when you said uh, the people of Bengal, like it's a different country. In fact, so I have friends from Calcutta, and I used to call them like Calcutta is their own country. Like every time they had this pride that the first ice cream machine was in Calcutta, first this is in Calcutta, and I'm like, okay, so yeah, but
Yeah. Bengalis are inordinately proud of Calcutta and really not concerned about the rest of Bengal. So yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to go on there. But yeah, I hope you read it and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Okay, so should we call it a close then? All right. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us, Manjima. It was really nice talking, albeit with a small group. Uh, much, much that I have learned from having this conversation with you. Thank you so much, and
Very happy.
hopefully others will listen to this and get the insights too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you
Bye.
so much,
Bye.
Manjima.
And thank you,
Bye.
Drama Center, for this opportunity. Drama Library.
Thank you, Manjima.